have got a feast in store for you in the next hour. So I hope that you'll ask Arthur lots of questions, and we're going to be playing you 4 different clips, which are stylistically all quite different. So you're going to get a really good sense of different documentary styles and why Arthur's chosen to shoot things in a particular way. So without further ado, would you welcome Arthur for me? And I'm just going to do a very quick little bit of background. So I've got a little introduction here which says Arthur's an award-winning documentary maker. He studied art history at Cambridge, where he joined the Footlights. At that time, his main interest was comedy, and that's where his career in television began. But it wasn't long before he realised he wanted to make documentaries. So, right, let's just take the story up at that point.
Sure.
Because I think for lots of people here, the buzzing critical question is actually, how do you get your foot in the door?
Yeah.
So you were interested in comedy.
I was. So I was temping various jobs in London. I signed up to a temping agency, and me and my writing partner from university were writing sort of script-based comedy together and speculatively sending it off. And we had some interest from various companies, and we got quite close a few times to getting things away, pilots, etc. And it wasn't quite working. And after about a year, he moved on to do a broadcast journalism degree at Cardiff. And I was sort of floating about thinking, well, maybe I'll move into comedy production, keep going with the writing, but move into production as well, run the two alongside each other. So I sort of looked around for companies that I liked, and Zeptron, Charlie Brooker's company, worked out of Endemol. So I got in touch with Endemol just looking for any job, a runner's job. And the first job they gave me was a runner's job on something called Celebrity Scissorhands, which was a sort of studio-based series at Television Centre where celebrities were trained how to become hairdressers.
Brilliant.
So it certainly wasn't comedy. And I did that for about 5-6 weeks, and then moved on to Celebrity Big Brother as a runner. The one with Jade Goody and Shilpa Shetty, so that was quite exciting. And it was around that time I was thinking, well, actually, I'm sort of not sure whether comedy is what I want to do sort of long term. I felt like it wasn't actually a massive jump from comedy into documentaries in terms of the style of comedy that I was writing was very observational, based on sort of character studies. And I think that shares quite a lot with documentaries. So I sort of exploited every connection I had at Endemol and got a job at a place called North One. Mm-hmm. And they used to make a lot of cutting edges for Channel 4. There's a guy called Mark Raphael there who now runs 72 films, but he also became a commissioning editor at Channel 4 shortly after I joined North One. And I developed an idea for a documentary, a cutting edge, about 4 8-year-olds going to boarding school. And it was it was originally conceived as 4 boys, but it ended up being 4 girls. And the idea was to sort of explore the impact that leaving home at that age had on them, but also on their parents, primarily their mothers. So Mark left to go to Channel 4, and he said, if you can get the access, I'll commission it.
Brilliant.
And he did. He was good to his word, and I worked on that as an AP, as an assistant producer. So
that's interesting, isn't it, in terms of you developing that idea?
Right.
So is that something that people here should be thinking about? Because, so for me, that's been my lifeblood. I have generated most of my work over my career as a director. Is that something that you've been doing?
I did a lot. I probably generated more ideas when I wasn't directing than I am now that I'm directing, partly because when you're directing, you're so focused on what you're doing, and when you come back up for air, you tend to sort of run out of time to develop the idea before you need to get back into making the next film. And there are lots of production companies with wonderful development teams that are working on ideas the whole time. But as an AP, I think I developed 3 or 4 things that ended up being made by other directors that I could work on. And I think that's a really good way to get yourself noticed. Even if that idea doesn't turn into a documentary, I think to go to companies, to development teams, talk about ideas that you've had, I think they're more inclined to take you on if they feel that you sort of understand what would make a good documentary, would be a good fit for working up ideas at that company. So I definitely recommend it, yeah.
Okay, so one of the burning questions as well is, Now, when you're making documentaries, you really, you need to learn how to shoot. So how did that work? So I'm just trying to get you to the point where you actually got your first film.
Sure.
So just quickly talk us through that trajectory, because that actually is a stumbling block for lots of people, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And the only training I've ever done was a sort of 2-day course to learn how to use a PD-150, which is a camera that no one has to use anymore, thankfully. But I was able to shoot taster tapes when I was working in development. So you'd go out and, you had to record sound and picture properly, but it didn't need to look amazing because it was only for the channel to look at internally and decide whether they wanted to commission something. So you can sort of work up your skills doing that. And then I guess the first documentary that I appeared on, because we were following 4 girls doing things at exactly the same time, we had to sort of split stories, me and my director. So even though my shooting wasn't brilliant, I had the opportunity to film for broadcast on that. And then I'd sort of sit in the edit and look at how what I'd filmed was being edited and listen to the editor sort of cursing over my rushes and saying, I can't use this because of X, Y, and Z. And you sort of learn from your mistakes. But I think it was easier when I started out. I don't think the level of filming across the board from self-shooters was so good. And I think you could get away with not shooting as well as you're sort of required to shoot now. So I have a lot of sympathy for people starting out who don't shoot, and I think it can seem very intimidating, and the level of self-shooting is very good now. But you just need to get your hands on a camera and practice as much as you can, and be open to criticism and get people who do shoot, or directors that you might know or work with in your career to tell you what you've done well and what you haven't.
And that's so important, isn't it?
It
That's
is,
how you
yeah.
learn. Yeah. So you were APing, you're shooting APing,
Yep.
and then you got a director's gig.
So I did, yeah. So I worked with a few brilliant directors and shot films for them, and then a company called Century took a punt on me, directing 2 half-hour programs in an 8-part series for ITV about Brits living in Corfu. So I sort of took that on, and I guess the stakes weren't too high, and they were willing to sort of take a bit of a risk, but they knew I could shoot properly, and I guess they felt that I could be helped through the edit. But then you get that edit experience, and half of filmmaking is in the edit, probably more, and you work with a good experienced editor, and you learn from them. And once I got those 2 films under my belt, I was sort of away, really.
Yes. So then you did Police Custody.
Then I did something else at a company called Blast, and then after that I did the first series of 24 Hours in Police Custody, which was the sort of first time that mix of rig and sort of off-rig shooting had been used. So previously 24 Hours in A&E was pure rig. So I was quite interested in a hybrid. A lot of people, when I was starting out, were finding a lot of work on rig shows. And I was always quite resistant to that because I felt that you were learning certain skills, but I was always interested in self-shooting. I always had an eye on making self-shot films and single documentaries. But I guess the hybrid kind of interested me, and there's a lot to learn from rig shows in terms of storytelling.
So then we get to Louis Theroux.
Yeah.
Now, so just tell us how you got that gig. I mean, that's amazing. Fantastic film to work on and to direct. So just tell us how that came about.
So after 24 Hours in Police Custody, I made a film at the BBC about cleaners, domestic cleaners, a single for a sort of briefly resurrected strand called Modern Times. So I guess they were taking a bit of a punt on me making my first single. But Aisha Raphael, who was working there at the time, I knew a little bit, and so I made that film, and then I had my first child. Not personally. My wife had our first child, and I was looking for something that would allow me to be at home a little bit more. So I'd never done anything with talent before. But Aisha called me up and said that Louis was thinking about making another film about Jimmy Savile, which was obviously immediately interesting. And I can remember my son was 4 weeks old, and we'd gone up to a wedding up in the Lake District, and he was sort of strapped to my front, and I'm pacing around a field talking to Louis, who I'd always watched his films growing up and really admire his work. So that was quite a thrill, and I sort of immediately struck by how open he was to suggestions about how to make the film, because it's deeply personal for him, and I think that he was sort of very anxious about returning to the subject, but felt compelled to. And I felt immediately that the film that I'd be interested in making, that he seemed to be interested in as well, was one that put him at the centre of the story as well.
Gosh, incredible. So, just talk us through that process for you making that film with Louis, because you'd presumably seen the first film.
Yeah. I mean, I was 16.
You did your homework.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd watched the first film, but I didn't know anything about the years that followed that first film. So talking to Louis, I discovered that they'd maintained a sort of a sort of friendship, work relationship. And Louis, being a sort of naturally inquisitive journalist at heart, had, I think, acknowledged that he hadn't got to the heart of who Savile was, but didn't know what that was. And so had maintained contact with him, and over the years had sort of visited him, or had Jimmy Savile come and visit him down in London. So he's back and forth between London and Leeds, and he would often film things, not for any programme, but just sort of he felt he should. And so there were all of these rushes that existed, all of this footage that had never seen the light of day, which was an amazing sort of foundation to build out of. And I think Louis had held on to a sort of box of photos and correspondence and books, and so we sort of thought that was a device to sort of go back into their history. And at the time, the BBC were doing the Dame Janet Smith inquiry, so it was a sort of very contentious subject. And I think a lot of anxiety at the BBC about approaching the subject and whether Louis should. But I think that once they decided that he should be allowed to, and we had sort of talked about the film that we wanted to make, they sort of stepped back and let us get on with it. And there was then a lot of anxiety once we'd finished making it about whether they could broadcast it in the form that it ended up in. And we sort of dug our heels in, and I sort of felt that if Louis was going to be allowed to make the film, he should be allowed to say what he wanted to say about it.
And what was his, for people that haven't seen the film, what was his, as that process for you as a filmmaker, pulling out and guiding Louis through those moments of revelation and those moments of realisation, I guess. Just how did that happen?
It was really interesting. I mean, it was just talking constantly, and I think that Louis genuinely didn't know how he felt about their history and about whether he should have known more or worked Savile out. And while the film wasn't a sort of mea culpa, I think that I recognised that there was an interesting way to use Louis as someone who stood in for everybody, and that he sort of had the wool pulled over his eyes by Savile in the same way that the public did. And so to sort of explore how that had happened to him was a way to explore how Savile had done it to everybody. So, and I thought he was very brave in being as open as he was in accepting responsibility, probably too much responsibility. But I think that it had obviously eaten away at him since the scandal had emerged, and since everyone had discovered the extent of Savile's abuse. And I think he questioned why he wasn't able to see it. So, I mean, it was no more than that, really, trying to work out not so much... it wasn't so much a telling of the abuse as sort of Louis building a portrait of a man who was able to carry out that abuse and hide it from the world so convincingly.
I mean, what struck me was, Louis as a mature man looking back on his much, much younger self.
That's true.
And, that sort of sense, there's a bit, isn't there, in the film, a bit later on where he goes into the Flying Pizza in Leeds and, he knows that Savile is sort of almost trying to champion his career and almost groom him as well. I thought that was really interesting. And Louis as an adult looking back on, this sort of the flattery of actually having somebody like him pay attention and pay interest in him. Is that fair to say, do you think? Yeah,
I think in the years since Louis made that, I think he was only 29 when he made that first film. Obviously, Louis has grown up as a filmmaker and has become a more serious journalist. I mean, I actually think at the time, it was in that era of Louis films where he was quite playful, where his trope is to sort of come across as unthreatening and give people enough rope to hang themselves, and I think the first film was very good. It will be hard to ever watch it, and sort of. People's perception of it has changed over the years, but at the time, he'd actually got a lot closer to a a sense of who Savile was than others had. And there were sort of various clips that did the rounds after the scandal emerged from that documentary where Savile seemed to be sort of flirting with the truth a little bit. But yes, I think that's true. I think Louis was sort of reflecting on how the person that he was back then was able to be sort of beguiled slightly by Savile.
And for you as a filmmaker, that was a bit of a departure for you, wasn't it? Because you'd done a lot of observational stuff.
Right, it was the first time I'd worked with talent. But I sort of tried to bring the same sensibilities. I guess by making a film as much, about Louis as a film by Louis. And originally, the idea for the film had been to use no voiceover from Louis, but a series of sit-down interviews that I'd done with Louis, where his uncertainty over his own feelings sort of came to the fore a lot more because he would and ah over his answers and really there was more head-scratching. I really liked that version. The BBC thought it was too dangerous a sort of film to put out in the end, so we didn't. But I think it was an opportunity to work in a slightly different way, but also, to make a film that didn't belong to Louis' sort of normal oeuvre of work. So it was a 75-minute long film, and I think that the way that we cut it was slightly unusual for sort of Louis' normal style of filmmaking. So I felt creatively we were sort of, because of the subject, we were let off the hook a little bit.
Okay. Now, has anyone got any questions for Arthur on Louis? At the back over there. Can you stand up for us, please? And is there another question on Louis while we're here?
Hi.
Hi.
So obviously working on that documentary would have been really emotional. Did you have to sort of detach yourself from those emotions to get the job done, or did you kind of incorporate them into the work that you were doing?
I think that's a really good question for sort of all filmmaking, documentary filmmaking. You do get very emotionally involved, and I think you need to harness that. I always think that films that I make are as much a reflection of my sort of emotional response to a subject as they are to the sort of intellectual response to a subject. So you don't want to shut off emotion. Equally, you need to be able to function while you're making films. I think because I shoot my own stuff, there's a process of sort of slight detachment when you're shooting. You're having to think about whether you're framing something properly, whether things are in focus. You're sort of conscious of mood, and you need to be responsive to mood as you're filming. But it's often later that the impact of what you filmed sort of really sort of plays out. But it was difficult. We went out and found lots of people who'd been abused by Savile, and I would spend a lot of time with them first, talking to them, working out what their story was, feeding that back to Louis. Louis would come and sort of the first time he met them was first, we'd film immediately, so he wouldn't meet them first. But it was quite harrowing, a lot of very difficult detail.
Okay, well, let's move on. So your next clip is very different.
Yes.
So just tell us what happened then. So you then went on to work for Minnow.
Yeah, so I went to a company called Minnow, who are fantastic, who I'm still at, or they're just about to leave. And they had developed a 3-part series for the BBC about the American justice system. And we had access in Jacksonville in northern Florida to, I think initially we just knew we could film in the courts. But we went out and sort of negotiated access to a lot more.
Let's watch the next clip.
Some believe the criminal justice system is in need of serious reform and that racial tensions are at historic highs. So do you believe there's a need for criminal justice reform nationally and locally? And if not, why not?
In 3 weeks, Jacksonville elects its next state attorney.
Our law enforcement officers are the symbol of authority on the street, and they must be obeyed. They must be obeyed because they are here to protect every single one of us.
But mid-campaign, attention switches to a series of shootings across America. It starts with 2 black men being killed by police in 2 days.
You shot 4 bullets into him, sir.
I told him not to reach for it. I told him to get his hand out.
And culminates with retaliations against police in Dallas.
5 officers were killed and 7 wounded in the attack at a downtown Dallas protest over the recent killings by police of black men in Louisiana and Minnesota.
Protests erupt across the country. and hit Jacksonville at the same time as the presidential election.
And we're going to respect our police because you have to respect our police. We're not going to shoot our police. We're not shooting our police. And we're going to have law and order.
You're xenophobe. You're racist. He's racist.
We're going to make our country safe again. We're going to make our country great again, as sure as you're standing here. Thank you. Thank you,
Jackson. Jackson 911, what's the address of your emergency?
911. We just got shot. It's like 4 or 5 people shot. We at 1214 LaBelle. Send the ambulance to everybody right now. Right now.
Sir, who got shot?
My wife, my baby.
Your wife? Your wife? Sir, who was shot?
Stay with me, bro. Stay with me. James, stay with me.
Hello?
Get him now.
A mass shooting at Eureka Gardens last night left 7 people wounded.
Police are reviewing security footage, hoping it will help lead them to 3 gunmen who fired 50 rounds into a group of people last night.
Great. So there's all sorts of questions here, aren't there, about, you know, when you're faced with something like that kind of series, so that access-based doc.
Mm-hmm.
How much do you know before you start?
Not a huge amount. I mean, I think we knew that you could show more in America.
Yeah.
Obviously, it was a really interesting time politically. And in Florida, they had local elections for the Office of State Attorney. So the State Attorney is the sort of head of the prosecution department in that area. So all of that was an interesting sort of political backdrop. But we knew we could film in the courts, and we'd negotiated that before we'd gone out. And then when we were on the ground, we were able to negotiate access to the State Attorney's office, to the Public Defender's office, to the prison, and to the police department, and to their homicide team. So we had a sort of 360 look at the system, which you just wouldn't get here in the same way. Yeah. And I think, you know, that's by virtue of being outsiders and Brits, and the BBC carries some clout in America. And I think that we are an antidote to sort of fast turnaround, some sensationalist local press. And so we said we're going to be making something that broadcast for at least a year, and it's a long-term project, and we don't need to start immediately. And we were able to spend months on the ground researching before we started. But it was just an incredible opportunity. And I don't think we knew when we started we were going to get as much access as we did. Yeah. But in the end, that was all important because we only had about sort of 6 months of principal filming to get it done, and the justice system takes a long time to work cases through from start to finish. So our ability to bounce around lots of different precincts meant that every episode of the 3, that was the start of the second episode, would follow an investigation, but it would also follow a court case. And they'd be different cases, but they would obviously be linked thematically. Yeah. So you'd get a sense of having passed through the whole system, following multiple cases, rather than the ability to film sort of 3 years following one case the whole way through.
So just talk us through the team, Arthur, because that feels very daunting if it's you on your own.
Sure, yeah. So it was me and one other director, we series directed together. And we would shoot together often or separately, and we would share each other's footage in the edit. So I edited 2 of the films and he edited 1, and we each had a producer. But it was no more than 4 of us on the ground. Okay. So we both self-shot, and our producers would sort of boom for us. Yeah. Or sometimes we'd shoot on our own if we needed to. Yeah, okay. Yeah, and so in terms of finding the stories, because that is a lot of work if there's only 4 of you. Yeah, well, we had quite a lot of pre-production. So, I mean, Morgan, who runs the company, had done an initial recce, I think, to get a sense of the access that we might get, so that the channel were willing to sort of commit to it. Yeah. But they took a bit of a punt by saying, go out there and make it, and here's the money to make it. So we did. We had sort of 2 or 3 months of negotiating access and working out what stories were there and waiting for the right cases and sort of tentatively feeling our way into filming. And then just a lot of film. I mean, we didn't sort of take a day off for several months. Yeah.
And just tell me, as you were going along then, you knew what your stories were. So generally, once you'd started, you did have your trajectory of you've got various cases, various stories that you're following. So
by the time we went into
are
the
you
edit,
starting to think, okay, in the edit, we're starting to shape it in your head?
Sure. I mean, I think initially you're just drawn to good stories.
Yeah.
We knew that we wanted to cover the politics because that felt a little bit different and a great opportunity. And obviously, Trump coming through town, we weren't going to miss that opportunity. Yeah. So we were filming that, and then we were just waiting for cases that piqued our interest to come through the sort of police department, murder cases. And once we sort of started filming a couple of those, I guess we were starting to look for cases that were arriving in court that in some way sort of would join up thematically with what we were filming in our sort of murder investigations. So this episode was all about sort of the difficulty in prosecuting black crime in America because of the perception of racism within the justice system. So that investigation, which is about start as a mass shooting in a sort of predominantly black housing complex, and then the court case we followed in that episode was a black-on-black crime in a strip club. So there were obviously, I think the episode was called Witness, so it was all of the difficulty in drumming up witnesses during that investigation was playing out in court as well, where they were really struggling to get people to come and talk. So even though the prosecutor was working on behalf of a black victim, he was also looking to prosecute a black man. So it was complicated. And Black Lives Matters was going on throughout that, and a sort of a further B story was that a young black man was shot by a white officer while we were filming there, so we also followed that as a sort of third story.
And what's the knack with keeping access in those big institutions?
I think you're constantly negotiating it, and I think there are times where it looks a little bit dicey, and maybe you have upset people by filming more than they wanted you to film, but it's relationship building. Access is much like finding contributors you're going to film with. You need to find a rapport, you need to get on with them, you need to be unthreatening, and you need to work hard to maintain it. And you do more work when you're not filming. You spend sort of more time with contributors not filming than filming. So by the time you pick up a camera and start, that relationship is fairly solid. But of course there are times where access falls down and you have to sort of work to get it going again. Or sometimes you never do, but it's a knack that you acquire over time. I mean, grooming, it would put too strong a word on it, but you are working out how to get what you want, while obviously maintaining absolute integrity in terms of what you're promising to make. And people get to watch the programs at the end, so you're always mindful of that. And that's something you can promise them. You're going to get to watch this before it broadcasts. You're going to get to give feedback. They don't have editorial control, but they can check for factual inaccuracy and fairness. And I think you always, while you're making it, you're mindful of the film that you're going to end up showing them. And you feel a responsibility to make something that they feel is fair and an honest reflection of the story that you've been following with them.
I mean, that's a question I get asked so much, is how do I know you're not going to stitch us up? And that's the first question, isn't it?
It helps if you can point to a body of work as well.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Now, any questions on what we've been just talking about now in terms of access? Hello, this over here, please. Could you stand up for us? Would you mind?
Hi, so I'm from Jacksonville.
Oh, wow.
My house is 10 minutes from the shooting, Eureka Gardens.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
So my question is, for you, what was that experience like, to experience what we see every day and then still try to maintain your integrity?
Yeah, I mean, it was an eye-opener and nerve-wracking. And, we'd sort of sometimes feel quite vulnerable. We'd spend a lot of time on our own, sort of moving about neighborhoods that we really didn't know very well. That maybe we'd be visiting, with police, and then suddenly you're there on your own and people are very skeptical about you. But you sort of feel that if you can fall into conversation and explain what it is that you're making and why it is that you're there, that people will sort of open up to you. And that's what happened, but it was a very sort of politically unstable period. And it was 2016 is the beginning of 2017, with local elections happening, but also the presidential elections and Black Lives Matter movement. So, I think the series is a sort of is a reflection of us working out, what that environment was. We were outsiders, and we were coming in and honestly portraying what it was that we discovered. But I think the ability to move between the community and the authorities was all important. We didn't want to make something that was entirely based with the authorities.
Okay. And my last question is, did the authorities really participate? Like, how open were they to, because the city's pretty hush-hush about...
They were really open, yeah. So Arthur Cary, who you may or may not remember, was the state attorney at the time, and a sort of notoriously difficult woman. But she opened up to us and got every prosecutor in her department to give us access. And then the public defender's office thought they better take part for balance. And then the state attorney's office and the police department obviously work very closely together. In America, you'll have a prosecutor at the crime scene straight away. So they're working together from the start to build a case. So they opened up to us too. And it was sort of a snowball effect, I guess. In the end, everyone opened their doors. The community was probably the hardest thing to win around. Yeah.
Okay, now I'm going to move us on, actually, because I don't want to run out of time. So we are now going to look at two films where, stylistically, you've got such a brilliant range of different styles here. So you then went on to work on two films simultaneously, really.
Yeah.
And I've done that. That's really hard work. And you're juggling and, trying to figure out how does that one, it's very difficult, isn't it?
Yeah.
So just, I think let's look at Last Survivors first, and then we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about War and Blood.
Great.
Yeah, so can we look at Last Survivors, please?
My mother and her father on their holidays. Yeah, when you think what was about to happen, it's kind of surreal. My mother gave this to me on Christmas Day, and at the time I was really disappointed because I thought, what sort of a Christmas present is this? It's still a pretty strange Christmas present. She wrote us a letter, and this is the letter. Dear children, I have written and compiled this document with one thought in my mind, namely that I am dedicating it to you and to your children. We have never talked much about those dark days and how it came about that you do not have any grandparents. I was 20 years old when I finally came to England, and a mad scramble began to try and make up for lost time. I was hell-bent on becoming a cellist, and in time a mother. At what point does one start explaining to one's child that there are people in the world who had as their ideology the total annihilation of Jews and other undesirables by murdering them in the most sophisticated manner?
But this is not family conversation, that sort of thing, Would you talk to your children about things like that? No, exactly. Exactly, yeah. Who can make sense of it? There's no sense in anything that happened. So it doesn't fit into normal life, I wanted to have a normal life. So the Holocaust doesn't fit in there. I don't want to be pitied or whatever. No, it's different times now. And hopefully we don't revert too much into disaster again.
You feeling all right? Enjoy lunch?
Yeah. Well, I'm not mad on the vegan business.
Yeah, it was delicious.
Yeah, it's delicious.
I was interested to talk to the two of you about what kind of role you feel Maya has going forward after you're gone. In terms of
Maya has more of a role than the average because she's so interested in the second generation trauma.
What do you feel that second generation trauma is?
That you must not ask me. That you must ask her.
But no,
I don't know what the trauma is.
But I guess you raised the second generation, so maybe you were witness to what's...
No, I'm sorry. I'm not. I will not elaborate on second generation trauma. To me, anybody who's got a roof over their head and enough food, forget the trauma.
So, stylistically, you're given this film to make.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, every film that we make is a massive responsibility, isn't it? But it feels like, you know, this is a particularly...
Yeah, I was quite intimidated by it. And
why? So just talk us through, you know, those decisions that you made in the way that you chose to make that film.
So I think all that the BBC said that they wanted was a film about Holocaust survivors. You know, they had a season of programmes to mark the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of the Second World War, and they knew that they wanted a feature film at the heart of it that used testimony that maybe hadn't been heard before. But I was quite committed from the beginning to not falling back on a film that was entirely testimony and archive driven. And I felt that if I was making a film now rather than 10, 20, 30 years ago, there needed to be a reason to be making that film. So I wanted to use that distance from the event. So I was fortunate enough to have 2-3 months to go out and meet Holocaust survivors before I had to decide what film I was making. And I must have met 60, 70 survivors thereabouts. Sort of, no one actually knows the exact figures, but about 150 survivors left in the UK. And in talking to them, I was struck by how normal they were, how funny they were, and also, you know, how differently they had processed trauma from their childhood. All of them were children at the time of the Holocaust, so I thought that was an interesting angle as well. How do you make sense of childhood memory and trauma? But I was also meeting their families, and suddenly I was coming across these notions of second-generation trauma, which I didn't know much about before. I mean, I'm not Jewish, so I also felt a responsibility as an outsider making this film. You know, you would imagine it going in, but you're really struck when you do start making this sort of film at how important it is, the community, to make films that chime with how they feel and that they feel does justice to the subject. So I decided that I wanted to make a film that was set more in the present and that you would discover about the past by spending time with them in their day-to-day lives, and that their relatability was incredibly important to me. Whether it's just, you know, shots of someone doing the lawn mowing outside and them having lunch together in a very ordinary setting, and the sort of bickering going on between mother and daughter that you can relate to, albeit that, you know, what they're bickering about is something that you can't really relate to. So I wanted to show survivors with sort of foibles, really, and as flawed individuals. Rather than putting them on a pedestal, because I felt that if they could be made relatable, I felt that the impact of what they were saying was going to land much more with the viewer. And I wanted to find, you know, a way into the subject that invited a sort of new generation into the Holocaust. And I think we've all become slightly desensitized to images from the Holocaust archive that we see again and again. It's horrific, but because we've seen it in school, it's part of the curriculum, somehow it doesn't sort of affect us emotionally in the way that it should. So we only used about 1.5 minutes of archive in the 90-minute film.
Amazing.
And I had a long enough period, a year, filming on and off with 6 different survivors to follow stories. So people that I found and filmed with were either people that were emotionally still working through something, or were sort of literally on a journey. So there was an artist I met who sort of worked through the sort of trauma of his past through his work, and he was working towards a new exhibition. But Anita, in the time that I was filming with her, went back to Berlin and spoke at the Bundestag in front of Angela Merkel in an extraordinary, defiant way. Another man went back to Auschwitz for the first time. He'd lost 7 siblings and both his parents, and he went with his daughter because she wanted him to open up emotionally about his past in a way he never had. So there was a lot of tension in their relationship. So, yeah, it was. I mean, it really is about who you cast. I could have found 6 different people and made an entirely different film.
Absolutely.
So it's so important to to think really hard about who it is that you're filming with and why you're filming with them, and that balance of characters.
And that juxtaposition between, so you've got lovely moments of Obdoc in that film, haven't you? And then you're cutting back to those interviews.
Yes.
And also you made incredibly bold decisions. So 90-minute film, no music.
No music, yeah.
Apart from the lovely lady dancing at the end.
Yes.
I mean, just brilliant. But that is really, so as you know, for filmmakers, that's incredibly exposing, isn't it? So tell me why you did that.
So I think it was born out of conversations that I had with the editor that I wanted to work with. So I was looking for an editor at the same time as I started to film. And the conversations that we had, we were both committed to making a film that didn't feel like a film you'd seen about the Holocaust before and didn't belong to the repertoire of Holocaust films that exist, and brilliant sort of testimony and archive-driven films. But I wanted to use my sort of Obdoc skills and my sort of love of unfolding story as the sort of beating heart of the film. And we both agreed really early on that we shouldn't use music because in a way using music was telling an audience how they should be feeling, and when it came to the Holocaust that didn't feel appropriate.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how many films you watch about the Holocaust that use, you know, big epic strings, and you do get sort of carried away by the music, but I wanted people to be carried away by what was being told to them. And it felt more confessional to have that silence, and I think people lean in a little bit closer and you hang on their words a lot more. And I think you're able to sort of react more honestly to the material if there isn't music to guide you. I mean, I love using music in film, but I just felt it wasn't the right decision for this film.
And it's so funny, isn't it, sometimes where you strip music right back.
Yeah.
You know, you can put music, I've had films where you put music on it and you just think, no, and you strip it right back, and it does feel really exposing. But the whole sense of finding that, I find music one of the most difficult things to do in a film.
Yeah.
And because you don't want to lead the audience in terms of what you want them to feel.
Yeah.
It's really difficult.
But it's something you play around with a lot at the beginning of an edit. You'll often put down guide music, and then you're having conversations with your composer and starting to tell them what it is that you're listening to, and they'll sort of write sort of slightly different versions of guide music that you're already using, and you feel your way into music through a project. I think you know, we were anxious about not having any music in this, but after sort of a week of cutting, we could sort of see the quality in the rushes and how my editor was putting them together without any music. It was a sort of simple decision from that point.
Okay, right. So we're about to run out of time, but I just want to talk about this final clip that you've got. So poor Arthur was also working on a film which was about cancer trials.
Yeah.
At the same time as making Last Survivors.
Yes. So it's bouncing between the two projects.
That's really hard emotionally for you, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I feel there's so much at the moment about duty of care of contributors, but actually duty of care of the people that are making the film. That's a really big thing. You know, you were dealing with so much emotionally here.
Yeah. So I was also making this film about a clinical trial for a potential cure for cancer. So it was being trialled for the first time on terminally ill patients. And the film is about two men, a 53-year-old man and an 18-year-old man/boy. And I filmed over sort of 18 months, and I got incredibly close to them. And you lose that a distance entirely. They become a part of your life. And sometimes I'd be filming on one project in the morning on War in the Blood, and in the afternoon I'd be doing a bit of filming on The Last Survivors. And my wife had another child in that time, so I was dealing with that at home as well, and I didn't really have anyone to talk to about it, and it's really difficult. And I'm still processing it now, having sort of finished the War in the Blood about 6 months ago.
Okay, well, let's just watch this.
My name is Clive. I'll be happy to look after you.
In my family, we've had our fair share of experience with cancer. Very close grandfather who developed a lung cancer that was detected very late. And also my own dad, he developed quite an aggressive prostate cancer. It sort of profoundly changes how you think about illness. I'm aware of what it's like to be the person on the other side. Maybe not as nervous as the patient, but I'm certainly very apprehensive around about these time points. You don't want to take away anyone's hope. Hello? Hello. How are you? It's very quiet and peaceful in here. Just to say, we have a bit of the marrow result back. So far, all we have is the fluid bit of the marrow. But I can say, when we look at it, we can't see any evidence of disease. There are no bad cells at all. Now, the reason that we're not sort of jumping up and down and, well, you know, we have to wait for the solid lump of the bone marrow, and that gets sent off to the lab and will take about a week, okay? Oh, bless her. Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
It is really good. Yeah, I think hopefully, you know, as Claire was saying, we'll get the rest of it back. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. No, Mrs. Will. No, we're really hopeful, but we have to see all the evidence before we can absolutely be sure. But we are, you know, really happy with that result so far.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Ben.
Okay. See you later.
So, Arthur, you had to juggle an incredibly difficult process there, because actually what you've got there are you know, unfolding narratives. You've got no idea what's going to happen. And also you've got a science element, which is always a bit tricky, isn't it, for us observational documentary makers. So how did you decide to try and incorporate the science in it? Because it's, you know, you have to understand the science to understand that film, don't you?
So by this point in the film, you understand the treatment that Mahmoud has received. You understand what's happened in his body. You understand what they're doing when they draw that blood out of his back. You're really sort of invested in that. And I felt early on through my research, getting my head around the treatment, that I wanted to make that palatable to an audience. More than palatable, really part of the storytelling. And in the end, you know, the film is a sort of juxtaposition of the dispassionate process of science and on the sort of bigger picture. And, you know, they've got to think about something that could be a cure in 10 years' time and sort of a mainstream treatment. But, you know, you're also filming with these patients who are terminally ill and this is their last hope. So, you know, it's a balance of those two. And I felt that was an incredibly important part of the story. So making the science work was all important. And
but you did that, didn't you, through your doctors? You invested in them as characters.
You do, yeah.
Because you get to know them, you really believe that,
right,
you know, they're there fighting every minute of the day, aren't they?
Yeah, and their responsibility to be honest and realistic with the patients who, you know, they come to care for and invest in emotionally as well. You've got to give people hope, because hope is all important in terms of sort of motivation to fight. But equally, you don't want to give false hope. So, you know, Claire in that clip is sort of wrestling with that and very anxious about what she's going to discover. She discovers that Mahmoud has responded well, is in remission. So, you know, that's a good moment for her. But equally, she's also delivering terrible news to people every day. And she doesn't want to feel that at the point of delivering that, people think, well, you know, what are you talking about? I thought this was a definite cure. And, you know, how does an 18-year-old get his head around that as well? Yeah. So it was him and a 53-year-old man at different stages of their lives. So, yeah, you know, primarily the film is about Graham and Mahmoud, but the moments you are with Claire and Martin Poulet, the scientist, are hugely important to sort of your understanding of the topic, but also the impact that those very sort of personal and emotional narratives are having on you.
I found it incredibly emotional at the end, though, when, Mahmood and Graham don't make it.
Yeah.
But then you put it into this sort of much wider context, and you show all the other people that are in remission, and that you understand what they've done, that they've actually, taken part in something and sacrificed.
Yeah, it sort of became a film about sacrifice. But I think you mentioned at the beginning, it's hard, you don't know the story you're going to get when you set off. And I was always committed to not making it about more than one or two people, because I wanted to be able to really go deep with them and follow them forensically. But of course, I had no way of knowing whether they would respond or not to the treatment. But I had very frank conversations with both of them early on about what would happen if they died. And they knew from the beginning that I was absolutely committed to telling their story. So for them, the film was a sort of legacy.
Of course.
Mahmood had two little sisters who will sort of get to watch this when they grow up, and Graham will have grandchildren he never meets. And I think that was a huge comfort to them and their families. But had they both survived, that would have been the story. But you have to be sort of honest with what you set out to do. So I wasn't going to sort of move on to another story if it didn't work for them. And Mahmood did go into remission, but then...
I tell you what, though, just what really struck me watching both of those films was just the fantastic freedom, in a way, in that longer form. Because actually, Last Survivors was 90 minutes, War and Blood was 100. That's massive, isn't it, in terms of the commitment for the channels? And do you feel now, because I feel like you just really had fantastic opportunity to breathe, to tell the story. Not, often in those situations you have to chop loads of stuff out, don't you? Because you've got to get to the next. It's about sort of sustaining it over that longer period.
Right.
Do you feel that actually the influence of Netflix and feature docs is actually having an impact now on terrestrial telly? Because you've had a fantastic opportunity in lots of these films to work at feature length, which is really, I think, really unusual for a director.
And I think there'll be more and more of those opportunities, as you say, because of Netflix and Amazon and Apple are now getting into commissioning YouTube soon enough, I'm sure. And I think the BBC and Channel 4 have to respond to that.
Yeah.
But there's just a huge appetite for documentaries at the moment, and for feature-length documentaries, and what you can do with a feature-length documentary compared to a sort of 60-minute film. I mean, there are some fantastic films that should exist at 60 minutes, but the sort of the style of storytelling that I like works better over that sort of long-form narrative arc. And I think bringing in tropes that you sort of borrow from drama, ways to tell story through the way that you can shoot, or music that you use, or the pace of your editing. I think more and more people want to borrow from drama when they're making documentaries. So it's, they sort of feel like a bit of a hybrid of sort of drama tropes, but sort of in service of sort of documentary storytelling. And the integrity of the story is always at the heart, but just sort of the range of tools that you have at your disposal to tell the story as well as you can.
Brilliant. So listen, we've probably got time for maybe one or two really quick questions. So who would like to go first? What a treat to listen to Arthur. Over there, please.
Hi, Arthur. Just a quick question regarding the evolution of projects, specifically the details. You spoke about the boarding school film and how that evolved from 4 boys to 4 girls. Was this something you felt applied to these 2 projects? And if so, was it you that instigated this, or was this a decision made on behalf of the broadcasters or the production company?
So I think, like I said, the Holocaust film was commissioned just as a 90-minute film about Holocaust survivors using elements of testimony, but no more than that. And then War in the Blood was initially commissioned off the back of a different scientist, a different trial in a different hospital, and that just never materialised, but the BBC were committed to that sort of project. And I just sort of kept them updated as I worked out what the real story was, and made them a part of that process, but they didn't tell me what to do. So it's organic. And I think it helps that, I have a relationship with the channel and there's an element of trust there. But, documentary storytelling, obviously observational documentary storytelling is always going to be something that needs to be quite organic and is changing as you go. And I think a big process, part of the process of making these sorts of films is constantly reevaluating what your story is, and that's changing daily, weekly. So you set off in one direction, and you take several different turns along the way, and you end up somewhere that you might not have anticipated. And that's part of the joy, I think, of telling these sorts of stories.
Great. Any more? Over here. Can you stand up, please? Thanks.
So my question is, sometimes there are stories which people covered a lot, and for example, you have to or really want to anyway make your own film about this. So what is the hardest part when you have to kind of talk about the same topic but from a different angle?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that was part of the thought process behind the way that I approached making The Last Survivors, was to make decisions like using very little archive, using no music, basing it much more in the present than sort of sit-down interviews talking about the past. Just find different angles in, make them figures that, you didn't sort of sit on a pedestal to sort of talk about the Holocaust in a way in which they had 100 times before, but to sort of find new ways to get them to open up to you and develop a relationship over time. And I guess my relationship is something that is unlocking things that I'm then filming and end up on screen. So it's very personal in that sense. And with War in the Blood, the decision to want to make the science a part of the film, there are lots of documentaries made in hospitals. And I think that I wanted to find a sort of a new way through that space. And the science was a big part of that, making it something that incorporated that and made it part of the storytelling. But also, it's sort of a human drama. I didn't shoot with nurses, and I didn't shoot sort of the sorts of shots that you might see in 24 Hours in A&E or Hospital or other programs, documentaries in hospitals. I chose to never collect that material. I never interviewed a nurse. I got to know them very well, but I didn't want to make them part of the storytelling. I was really focused on just the two patients and their families and the scientist and the doctor. So the hospital is the setting for it, but really it feels like a sort of human drama. You're just sort of constantly trying to challenge yourself in terms of ways to make a film that feel fresh and different.
So you've had to have some time off.
Well, time off from directing. So I've been doing a little bit of executing, overseeing other projects.
Yeah. But you do need a break. I mean, I've got to the end of projects where you just need to...
Yeah, you do, yeah.
You need to
you really live and breathe
rehydrate your brain, don't you?
You get to a point where and I think you need to be quite obsessive as a filmmaker, and particularly as a documentary filmmaker. You're thinking about it 24/7. You go to bed thinking about it. I dream about it. I wake up thinking about it. The conversations I have all day are about it. Mm-hmm. So there's no separation at all, and that can be quite tiring. So you need a bit of a break. You need to sort of recuperate and start reading and start engaging with the world in which you haven't while you've been making these films, and work out what it is that you want to make a film about next.
And can you tell us what you're doing next?
I don't think I can, actually.
Oh, okay.
But I'm about to start on a new feature-length film for the BBC, but it's not been announced, so I probably shouldn't do that now.
Okay. All right. Well, Arthur, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
What a treat to listen to you.